So in the last two lectures, we have basically asked whether or not the government can and should regulate the security of the cyber domain. We first asked how the US government might do the job, and then in the last lecture, we asked about the possibility of international regulation. In this lecture, we're going to shift the focus slightly to a different question. We're going to return our attention to America and ask not about government regulation, but about the idea of government control and protection. After all, one of the goals of the Constitution is the creation of government to provide for the common defense. We might say that the federal government is also responsible for defending cyberspace. We don't expect every manufacturing plant to have anti-aircraft guns, so why do we expect every cyber facility to have the cyber equivalent? And we do expect the police to patrol the streets and provide us with protection against murder and robbery. So shouldn't the government be patrolling for us the internet network and protecting us against attack there? I assume you can see some of the problems with that idea right away. If the government is on the network monitoring it for malicious activity, then the government is on the network monitoring it. That might be a good thing, but in America, we have a healthy skepticism of government surveillance. We don't have the government routinely watching our conduct because we don't want the government knowing all our business. If the monitoring is for illegal malicious activity, well, then it could also be for political activity, can't it? Well, whether you realize it or not, government monitoring of the internet is already a fact. So in this lecture, we have two goals. First, I want to briefly talk to you about how the on-network monitoring systems work. Then I want to step back a bit and tell you about how government monitoring is governed by laws, and particularly how it is limited by, but not prohibited by, the US Constitution. Let's start with the monitoring programs. The federal programs go by the generic name of Einstein. Einstein 2 is an intrusion detection cybersecurity system fully deployed by the federal government in 2008 to protect the federal cyber networks. Its successor program, Einstein 3, of course, which is still in development as of late 2012, not only detects cyber intrusions on the federal network, but also seeks to actively prevent them. In the next iteration, these programs will be moved from the federal system and increasingly be deployed on private networks to protect critical infrastructure. And therein hangs our tale, and a constitutional issue worthy of consideration. Because these private networks are also the ones that you and I use every day to talk to our friends or to participate in political rallies. An intrusion detection system, like Einstein 2.0, operates through what one might call a lookup system for spotting malicious code. Every piece of code is unique. It has what is known as a signature, essentially an identifying code component that serves as a marker for the program, like its DNA. Now, when we spoke about the problem of distinction in Lecture 3, we were talking about the difficulty of identifying malicious code. The problem, you may recall, is that when we first encounter malicious code, we can't tell that it's malicious. But eventually, with effort, the code can be identified as such, and its unique characteristics can be mapped. The detection program has a database of known malicious code signatures on file, and constantly compares incoming messages with malicious signatures. When it finds a match, it sends an alert to the recipient. For the federal system, Einstein 2 gets its database of malicious signatures from a variety of sources, including both commercial sources like Symantec, that's the private internet cybersecurity company, and classified sources at the US National Security Agency, or NSA. And for reasons that will become clear in a second, it's important to note that Einstein 2 is a gateway system, one that screens traffic as it arrives at federal portals, but does not stop any traffic at all. Einstein 3, the next generation of the program, is based on a classified NSA program known as tutelage, and is different in several respects. First, its goal is to go beyond Einstein 2's capabilities of detection of malware and an alert to take the next step of actual intrusion prevention. After all, simple detection is a bit like telling someone you're being robbed after the bank robber is already inside the vault. It is naturally far more valuable to prevent the robber from getting into the bank in the first instance. To do this, Einstein 3 must intercept all internet traffic bound for federal computers before it's delivered, delay it temporarily for screening, and then pass it along or quarantine the malware as appropriate. Einstein 3 also adopts another less definitive and more probabilistic method of identifying malware, something different from the lookup malware check system we already have. This new system goes by the generic name of anomaly detection. In essence, the Einstein 3 program knows what normal internet traffic looks like and can produce an alert when the incoming traffic differs from normal by some set tolerance level. So if traffic is coming from an IP address that has never been used before, or if it's occurring in large volumes at odd hours, that might trigger an alert, even in cases where we don't have a malicious code signature to compare the traffic to. And for that system to be effective, the Einstein 3 screening protocols must reside outside the federal government firewalls, on the servers of trusted internet connections. As you might expect, for the federal government, these trusted internet connections are all operated by American companies. There's little real legal debate over the operation of Einstein 2 or Einstein 3 as applied to government networks. Almost everyone who's examined the question agrees with the conclusion reached by the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel. It is appropriate and necessary for the government to monitor traffic to and from its own computers. After all, if any citizen sends a cyber transmission to the federal government, we can fairly presume that he wants it opened, and that if it is a malicious transmission, he has no legitimate interest in having it opened only in the way he wants it to be, so that it has a bad effect. Legal disagreement is much more likely to be over how deeply a government-owned and operated system such as Einstein, let's call it Einstein 4 if we want to, may be inserted into private networks, either to protect the government or to protect private sector users. The question is whether such a system would pass constitutional muster. Now, we should note here that in addition to constitutional questions, the full operation of Einstein 4 would require several amendments of existing statutory restrictions, amendments whose political viability is, frankly, highly questionable. Thus, while we begin with a discussion of the legality of the system, that doesn't mean we should lose sight of the related question of whether or not it's a good idea. Legal isn't always wise, and unwise isn't always illegal. But let's start with the law. To begin with, current doctrine makes it clear that there is a difference in the level of constitutional protection between the content of a message, the text of what it says, and the non-content portions, like the address on the outside of an envelope. In general, the non-content portions of intercepted traffic are not protected by the Fourth Amendment. That's the constitutional amendment that protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Supreme Court addressed these questions in a related context in two 1970s era cases, United States versus Miller and Smith versus Maryland. In both cases, the question was, in fact, does an individual have any constitutional protection against the wholesale disclosure of personal information that had been collected legally by third parties? And in particular, could an individual use the Fourth Amendment to prevent from using data it had received from a third-party collector without first getting a warrant? In both of these cases, the court answered with a resounding no. Along the way, it developed an interpretation of the Fourth Amendment that has come, unsurprisingly, to be known as the third-party doctrine. One has no constitutional rights to protect information voluntarily disclosed to others. The reasoning is that by disclosing it, the data owner has given up any reasonable expectation of privacy that he might have had. So, the Miller case involved bank records. According to the court, financial information voluntarily disclosed by an individual to a bank is not protected by the Fourth Amendment against subsequent disclosure to the government. So if you, say, write a check to a doctor or a political campaign, and the government wants a copy of the check from your bank, there is, according to the court, nothing in the Constitution that limits how they get it. They can just go and ask the bank for it. That probably surprises you. Yeah. It certainly surprised Congress, so much so that they immediately passed the Right to Financial Privacy Act, which put limits back onto what law enforcement could do. Now, the Smith case, Smith versus Maryland, that was pretty much the same song, just sung in a different key. In that case, the court held that an individual's telephone toll records, that is, the records of the phone numbers called by the individual, were not protected against disclosure. If you're willing to tell the phone number you're calling to AT&T or Verizon, you can't, the court said, complain if they in turn tell it to the government. In effect, the court has adopted a gestational theory of First Amendment privacy. Not just as you can't be a little bit pregnant, you can't, according to the court, be a little bit public and a little bit private. What you disclose to anyone is fair game for everyone else. One of the oddities of these two cases is that they're both pretty old. They come from the 1970s, back before personal computers even existed, and back before there was any real reason to be concerned with the wholesale collection of personal information, a topic for our next lecture. It's pretty curious, in the end, to talk about privacy on the internet when the basic case law predates the Apple computer. Recently, in a case in January 2012 called United States versus Jones, the Supreme Court indicated that it might reconsider the third-party doctrine in light of technological changes. But it hasn't taken that step, at least not yet. So we're left right now with this old 1970s doctrine. In the context of cybersecurity and intrusion detection, the same result follows pretty easily. Non-content header information in internet traffic, like IP addresses and the to and from lines of your email and such, are not protected from disclosure as a matter of constitutional law. Because that information has been provided to your internet service provider, it loses any constitutional privacy protection it might have. And a government-operated Einstein 4 system is free to scan the non-content portions of a message for malware. This analysis, however, gets us only part of the way to an answer. The Miller-Smith rule does not, by its terms, permit the use of an intrusion prevention system to routinely scan the content portions of an internet exchange. Those portions, the actual messages themselves, remain private, just as telephone conversations are also private. As a result, a government program typically may not review those content portions of a message without probable cause and a warrant. To think of this clearly, just think of the difference between an address on the outside of the envelope, which anyone can read, and the letter inside, which is protected by law from interception without a judicial warrant. One problem with this analysis is that in the cyber realm, the line between content and non-content is not so clear. Is the web address you type into your web browser content or not? In many ways, it looks like a non-content address on the outside of the envelope. But domain names on the internet often reveal the website's content in a way that regular addresses just don't. If you go to aa.org, then we know you're visiting Alcoholics Anonymous, with all of the resulting inferences about the content of your communications. Even more importantly, The content portions of an internet transmission may also be the portions of a message that contain malware. Indeed, it would be an extremely poor rule that permitted screening of only non-content information for malware, as that would simply draw a map for malfeasant actors on how to avoid the intrusion detection systems. As a consequence, any intrusion detection or prevention system that will be of any value in protecting the network must inherently have the ability to look at the content of communications if it's to be effective. So, bridging that gap, finding, if any, a constitutionally permissible way of looking at content is the difficult question. And again, as a reminder, even if the gap is bridged, that still leaves a large policy question. Do we really want the NSA, or any portion of the government for that matter, to be inspecting the private communications of American citizens? So, while we continue to talk about the law for now, let's not lose sight of the underlying policy question. For internet traffic directed to federal computers, the content-non-content distinction is comparatively easy to solve. Our Fourth Amendment concerns can be addressed by using a robust form of consent. The idea here is that protection against government scrutiny is a constitutional right, but it is a right you can give up voluntarily if you want to. If you give your consent to the government screening of your email, then all of the legality problems go away. So it turns out that consent is a pretty powerful tool. Interestingly, the consent concerns are more for the recipient, some federal employee, than they are for the sender. As we've said already, the sender loses his privacy interest in the content of an internet communication with the government when it's delivered. After all, he intended the recipient to get the message, and lawfully, the recipient may do with it what he likes, including putting it in the spam folder. The sender has little or no legitimate interest, once the mail is delivered to its intended recipient, in fooling the recipient into doing the wrong thing. So in Einstein 2 and 3, the main consent concern is actually for the recipient employee, who might have a privacy interest in the contents of the email. He doesn't necessarily want his federal employer screening the contents of his incoming mail. For these employees, however, the government can, and almost always does, make consent to email monitoring a condition of employment. You can't work for the government unless you agree, and your agreement is reinforced every day by a login click-through banner that warns you that your email will be monitored. Now, in the past, the government has monitored internet traffic to prevent government resources from being used for illegal or inappropriate purposes, say, downloading pornography. Today, that legal concept has simply been translated to the cybersecurity realm. And that discussion paints a good roadmap for how the government can and has begun to expand its presence into the private sector, where neither the sender nor the recipient is a federal employee or agency. The extension has begun with voluntary agreements between the government and big government contractors in the defense industrial base, what we sometimes call the DIB. Unsurprisingly, this program is known as the DIB pilot. So, how's that work? To foster their ability to do business with the federal government, these DIB companies have all agreed to deploy Einstein on their own systems and monitor incoming internet traffic using government-provided threat signature information. To be sure, their decision to do that is voluntary, but it is voluntary in the same way that Don Corleone makes you an offer you can't refuse. Those who don't join the program will likely lose some of their opportunity to get federal business. As with communications bound for the federal government, the non-content addressing information is not protected by the Fourth Amendment at all. And the senders have no expectation of privacy as against the recipient. And as to the actual content or substance of the message, all of the employees for the DIB participants, companies like Raytheon and Boeing, are, like their federal brethren, asked to consent to scrutiny of their communications as a condition of employment. Now you may ask, is this consent really consent? After all, if you have a good job as an engineer at, say, Lockheed Martin, and the company tells you that you have to consent to email screening or lose your job, how much real choice do you have? In practice, probably not much. But the answer in law is pretty clear, and it's the opposite. So long as you have a choice, it really doesn't matter if one of those choices is harder than the other. Thomas Hobson of Hobson's Choice fame had nothing on the government. So this so-called voluntary consent model is readily expandable to almost any industry that is dependent on federal financing, and therefore susceptible to government pressure. Already, there's talk of expanding this DIB model to the financial and nuclear industries. A more problematic extension might be to the healthcare industry or the education community. We could, for example, imagine the government saying to healthcare providers that continuing to receive Medicare reimbursements requires their consent to come under the federal protective cyber umbrella. At least in theory, there's no legal reason why any industry or company might not agree to those terms. And there's no real limit on how the government might gently use its financial clout to coerce cooperation. In the end, our objection to these further expansions is more likely to be one of policy than of law. The expanse of this voluntary consent model is quite wide, and it seems likely to occupy a significant fraction of the field. So now let's finally talk about policy. Even though it is probably legal to expand the federal government's protection of critical infrastructure, is it a good idea? The honest answer is that nobody knows yet. For me, this is really an empirical question. How effective is the extended protection, and how great a risk of abuse is there? While it's easy to think of theoretical answers, our policymakers are seeking hard data. And to their credit, they're doing so in a relatively cautious way. Most notably, instead of the National Security Agency, or NSA, actually running an Einstein 4 program on the private sector networks, the DIB program involves two limitations that are not legally necessary. First, the Einstein 4 program is actually going to be run by Internet Service Providers, or ISPs, the organizations like Verizon or AT&T who transmit Internet traffic to other private sector companies. The ISPs are using both software and threat signatures provided by the NSA. This means that, at least in part, the government has taken a hands-off approach to the screening. Second, because of fears that NSA's direct involvement in the program might raise the specter of Big Brother and the government collection of private communications, the private sector DIB pilot members are not required to provide any feedback to the NSA on the effectiveness of the program, though they may voluntarily provide some data on network intrusions. And so NSA is generally cut off from any private to government communications and cannot generally gain access to private sector content. Now, from this pilot, we've already learned two things. First, there is a persistent controversy over federal involvement in cybersecurity. Some, mostly the large internet service providers and other major internet players, argue that the private sector has made large investments in cybersecurity and that it is generally more nimble and more knowledgeable in key respects about its systems than the federal government could ever be. There's some support for this proposition. A recent internal study by the Department of Defense suggested that the DIB pilot's effectiveness has been a mixed success and some failures to meet expectations. Notably, in the first test phase during a 6-month period, only 2 of 52 discoveries of cyber threats by the DIB program relied on classified NSA signatures. All the rest were private sector. But neither the private sector nor the government really thinks that the DIB pilot is unnecessary, and there's at least some evidence that the government, and more particularly the NSA, is a value-added contributor to cybersecurity in the private sector. For example, in 2010, Google was hacked by the Chinese. The Chinese subverted Google's operating code and used it to try and get information on Chinese activists who were communicating through Gmail. When Google discovered the attack, it turned to the NSA for assistance in analyzing the intrusion. So, at least to some degree, even cyber market leaders like Google recognize the value of federal cyber assistance. The second thing the DIB pilot shows is that a fear of government intervention can have a tendency to hamstring the effectiveness of our collective approach to cybersecurity. This may not necessarily be a bad thing. Sometimes social values of independence are more important than efficiency and effectiveness, but we should at least be clear about the choices we're making. As I noted earlier, NSA agreed to forego any mandatory feedback from the DIB pilot partners on the effectiveness of the threat signatures that it provided. That was a pragmatic decision. NSA made the judgment that because providing enhanced security to the DIB was so important, it would rather do so without some feedback than risk the political controversy that might arise if it was suspected of performing secret wiretaps and threatening civil liberties. Even if the suspicion was false, its common acceptance would have paralyzed the pilot program and probably killed it before it even began. But we should make no mistake, this form of self-limitation was not intended to enhance effectiveness or efficiency. In short, though it is likely that the government could lawfully have expanded NSA's role through a strong consent model to include its active participation in the DIB pilot, it deliberately chose not to go to the limits of legal authority for political and policy reasons. As a pragmatic judgment of the politically possible in America today, that was probably a wise decision. As a policy for completely effective cybersecurity, it's probably the second best option. In any event, in mid-2012, the Department of Defense expanded the pilot and made it a permanent program and transitioned part of its management to the Department of Homeland Security. DHS is a civilian agency that's thought better suited for long-term management of civilian cybersecurity programs. So this form of consented government monitoring of critical infrastructure is likely to be part of our plan for defense for the foreseeable future. And what then of the remaining internet traffic? Private-to-private traffic that is not directed to or from a critical infrastructure industry or connected in some other way to the government. Here, the legal limits on the scrutiny of private content network traffic are at their highest, and they're likely to prevail. This is not to say that the private sector internet is without protection. We will talk more about private sector protections in a later lecture. But what it does mean is that the American government is likely to have little, if any, active role in the protection of most of the internet, both domestically and globally. For many in the cyber community, this is the right result. Others, however, look at this dichotomy and see a trend towards a bifurcated internet. One portion a closed, walled garden protected by high security, and the other a virtual free-fire zone reminiscent of the Wild West in the mid-1800s. Neither model seems quite optimal. The walled garden loses the vibrancy, transparency, and ease of borderless access that are the main characteristics of the internet as we currently know it. It is, if you will, internet light, all the features without the pizzazz. The Wild West, however, is a lawless domain where nobody is safe. No doubt, we will continue to search for a better way. One reasonably safe prediction is that governments will come under increasing pressure to provide security services on the internet. This will likely come to pass notwithstanding the fears of a threat to civil liberties, but only with significant oversight, I think. If government scrutiny of the network increases, then the constitutional issues we've been discussing will come back to the fore. And so, as a final thought experiment, let's consider two legal grounds on which the government might proceed to monitor the entire internet, at least in the United States. I should again hasten to note that a lawful plan is not necessarily a wise one as a policy matter, and I'm certainly not recommending these arguments. But here they are for you to think about for yourself. First, one might argue that wholesale scrutiny of network traffic is reasonable because the threat is so large. There's just an awful lot of malware in internet traffic. Here's how this argument might pass constitutional muster. First, the government could adopt an automated system that looks at all traffic but did not save any traffic that is determined to be safe, in effect using an auto-delete function, unless malware was found. Second, the government could agree not to prosecute anyone whose malware was stopped. The government could argue that broad-based scrutiny is akin to a sobriety checkpoint on the highway. That is, a necessary special needs administrative inspection that is acceptable precisely because of the harm it averts. Or here's a second, somewhat more ambitious approach, as if the other wasn't ambitious enough. The government could adopt a law that made consent to malware intrusion detection systems a condition of access to the internet. The analogy here would be to the implied consent laws that have been adopted by many states with respect to sobriety tests. In these states, acceptance of a driver's license and the right to travel on the public roads brings with it mandatory consent to a sobriety test. Refusal to blow is itself a crime. One can at least imagine, though probably not welcome, the adoption of such a regulatory system for the internet. All of which is to say that there is probably a wide scope of constitutionally permissible activity for the government, even on the private networks that are part of the internet. Exactly how far the government is permitted to go, in the end, is more likely a question of wise policy than it is of constitutional law. So, I hope that's given you some food for thought and a better understanding of the legal issues and policy issues behind cybersecurity. In our next lecture, I'll tell you about the remarkable and sometimes disturbing things that people can do with your personal information on the web, as we explore the concept of big data. I look forward to talking to you then. Have you seen the movie Minority Report? If you have, you remember its chilling portrayal of a world where three psychics, called precogs, are able to predict future acts. And as a result, you can be arrested for the murder you're about to commit, not the one you've already committed. They, whoever they are, know what you're going to do before you even do it. Married to that is a universal identification system using retina scans that links to a giant database that remembers everything about you. When you go into a store, the holographic welcomers happily chirp, "Welcome back, Mr. Rosenzweig. Will you be looking for another pair of shoes today?" They also know everything you've ever done in your life. You really do have a permanent record. The image is, in a word, horrifying. It portrays a world where everything about you is known and where your future actions can be predicted with accuracy. It's the world of George Orwell's 1984 made real by advanced technology. Now, it's a myth, of course, but nobody is sure for how much longer. Today, we call this phenomenon the problem of big data. Every click you take in cyberspace can be tracked. Your cell phone broadcasts your geolocation constantly. And all your purchases and phone calls are cataloged somewhere. Taken together, this information can be analyzed to paint a picture of you, one that increasingly others can see. And the result is a loss of privacy. In today's lecture, we begin a two-part discussion of how this is happening and what it means. In this first lecture, I want to mostly tell you about the idea of big data and show you some examples of how it works. In the next lecture, we'll talk about privacy laws and how we might go about reclaiming some privacy for ourselves. So what exactly do we mean by big data? Well, in an increasingly networked world, personal information is widely collected and widely available. As the storehouse of data has grown, so have governmental and commercial efforts to use this personal data for their own purposes. Commercial enterprises target ads and solicit new customers. Governments use the data to, for example, identify and target previously unknown terror suspects, to find what are called clean skins who are not in any intelligence database. We have discovered that we can link together individual bits of data to build a picture of a person that is more detailed than the individual parts. If you want a way of thinking about this, think of a tile mosaic or a pointillist painting by Seurat. Each bit of color by itself isn't much, but you put them all together and you can see a complete picture. We call this growth in the amount of data available, married to the increase in analytical capability, the phenomena of big data. Now, clearly, big data offers all kinds of opportunities to those who have access to it. Yet this new capability also comes at a price: the peril of creating an ineradicable trove of information about innocent individuals. If the government collects data to build a picture of, say, an unknown terrorist threat, it can also, if it's minded to, use it to build a picture of its political opponents. That sort of use of cyberspace poses threats both in America and, perhaps even more so, in authoritarian nations abroad. In thinking about this capability and the opportunities and threats it presents, we sometimes talk out of both sides of our mouths. Back in 2004, for example, there was a significant hype surrounding the most ambitious of these new big data programs, the Total Information Awareness Program, which was known as TIA. TIA was a research program initiated by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, in the immediate aftermath of September 11. The concept was to use advanced data analytical techniques to search the information space of commercial and public sector data, looking for threat signatures that were indicative of a terrorist threat. Because it would have given the government access to vast quantities of data about individuals, it was condemned as the harbinger of Big Brother and eventually killed. Compare that condemnation with the universal criticism of the government for its failure to connect the dots during the Christmas 2009 bombing plot attempt by Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib. In that case, we were, it is said, not doing enough data analysis, not linking NSA intercepts to State Department reporting or to travel records. So that conflict gives you some idea of the cross-currents that are at play here. The conundrum arises because the analytical techniques are fundamentally similar to those used by traditional law enforcement agencies, taking a lead and finding connections, but they operate on a much more vast set of data, and that data is much more readily capable of analysis and manipulation. As a result, the differences in degree tend to become differences in kind. To put this issue in perspective, just consider a partial listing of relevant databases that might be targeted: credit cards, telephone calls, criminal records, real estate purchases, travel itineraries, and so on. The technological reality is that all of that information is available somewhere in cyberspace, and it's easy for others to access, even though the average citizen probably thinks that his or her credit card records and web surfing habits are private. This is a fundamental change caused by technological advances that, like King Canute's fabled tide, cannot be stopped or slowed. The phenomenon derives from two related yet distinct trends: increases in computing power and decreases in data storage costs. Most of you have seen with your own eyes the steady increase in the power of computers. It's best expressed in Moore's law, named after Intel computer science scientist Gordon Moore, who first articulated the law back in 1965. Moore's law predicts that computer chip capacities will double every 18 to 24 months. Moore's law has been remarkably accurate for nearly 30 years. The effect of routine doubling is so great that we have to graph it logarithmically, where each step up the y-axis shows an increase by a factor of 10. In practice, what this means is that processor capacity today is more than 1,000,000 times greater than in 1970. The power of this processing capacity translates almost directly into processing speed. It is what drives the information technology tools that power Google and Amazon and what makes Walmart's purchasing system a reality. And though no one predicts that processing speed will double indefinitely, surely that's a physical impossibility, there is no current expectation that the limits of chip capacity have been reached. Married to this trend is another one, the remarkable reduction in the costs of data storage. Data storage costs have also been decreasing at a logarithmic rate, almost identical to the increases we've experienced in chip capacity, but in the exact opposite direction. What this means, in practical terms, is that while in 1984 it cost roughly $200 to store a megabyte of data, by 1999 that cost had sunk to 75 cents. And today you can buy 100 megabytes of data storage capacity for a penny. On eBay, you can frequently purchase a terabyte storage device for your desktop for less than $100. A terabyte is roughly 1 trillion bytes of data, a huge volume for storing simple alphanumeric information. Here too, the prospects are for ever cheaper data storage. One can readily imagine peta or even exabyte-sized personal storage devices. A petabyte is 1,000,000 gigabytes. An exabyte is 1 billion gigabytes. In 2009, the entire internet was roughly 500 exabytes of data. Yet within 10 years or so, that storage capacity may be available to a small corporation. So just imagine what a large corporation or a government could purchase and maintain. Therefore, the story of technology today requires us to answer the question: what happens when ever quicker processing power meets ever cheaper storage capacity? Anyone who uses Gmail knows the answer to that question. No longer do you have to laboriously label, file, and tag your email in order to find it again. You now simply store all the email you want to retain, and you use a simple natural language search algorithm to pull up relevant emails from storage when needed. The storage cost of Gmail to the user is zero. Google offers it for free. And the processing time for any search request for the average individual is measured in, at most, seconds. So here's how former IBM chairman Samuel J. Palmisano put it in a speech he gave in September 2011. Quote, "We're all aware of the approximately 2 billion people now on the internet, in every part of the planet, thanks to the explosion of mobile technology. But there are also upwards of 1 trillion interconnected and intelligent objects and organisms, what we call the Internet of Things. All of this is generating vast stores of information. It is estimated that there will be 44 times as much data and content coming over the next decade, reaching 35 zettabytes in 2020. A zettabyte is a 1 followed by 21 zeros. And thanks to advanced computation and analytics, we can now make sense of that data in something like real time. This enables very different kinds of insights, foresight, and decision-making." Now, our law and policy thinking hasn't caught up with this reality yet. 10 years ago, surveying the technology of the time, which by and large was 100 times less powerful than today's data processing capacity, Scott McNealy, who was then CEO of Sun Microsystems, said, quote, "Privacy is dead. Get over it." What he was describing was the loss of public anonymity, the ability to act whether physically or in cyberspace, without anyone having the technological capacity to permanently record and retain data about your activity for later analysis. American law actually has a phrase to describe this phenomenon. It's practical obscurity. Derived from a 1989 Supreme Court case, Department of Justice versus Reporters Committee, the origin of the phrase is instructive in illuminating the effects of the change in technology. Back in the late 1980s, practically at the dawn of time for computers, the Department of Justice went to a great deal of trouble to create a database with information about the criminal records of known offenders. At the time, those types of records were kept in lots of disparate databases that were not connected to each other. Arrest records might be held by a local police station, charging records by a district attorney, and disposition and sentencing records by a state court. Federal records were, of course, held by still other law enforcement authorities, attorneys, and courts. All of these records were generally public and, in theory, available for inspection by the press or private citizens. But in practice, the records were so widely scattered among so many data holders that no newspaper or individual could incur the expense of finding all the information and creating a comprehensive dossier on any individual. They were, in a phrase, practically obscure. Only the federal government had the degree of need and adequacy of resources to undertake the task of creating, at great expense, the precursor of what is today the National Crime Information Center. At very great cost, the Department of Justice began collecting criminal records on a small number of criminals, mostly prominent mafia dons, who were of national interest. The Reporters Committee case was a powerful expression of the strength of the paradigm of practical obscurity. A CFI, a press organization, filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Department of Justice, asking for the collated dossier, or the rap sheet, on alleged mafia figures. Their reasoning was, to me, quite persuasive. Since the information was all public when found in the disparate databases, it did not lose that public character when collected by the federal government. And if it was public information, then it was clearly subject to disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act.